listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a show that discusses internal and relational anxiety, how it blocks effective leadership, and how we can move through it to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
When I first started thinking about launching this podcast last year, there was a handful of people that I knew I wanted to be a guest on the show, not just because they're very interesting people, but because they've made significant contributions to this field of leadership anxiety and family systems theory. And that absolutely describes today's guest. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Creech. Robert is the professor of pastoral leadership, and he's also the director of pastoral ministries at Truett Seminary, which is part of Baylor University in Waco. Robert wrote a book with Jim Harrington and Tricia Taylor, I think it was about 12 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, called The Leader's Journey. Many of us have read and greatly benefited from that book. It's actually coming out in a second revised edition next year. But Robert just recently released a book, and I'm about a third of the way through it now, and it's a fantastic book. If you're looking for a good primer to get into systems theory, how to begin to apply it, I'd recommend Robert's book. It's called Family Systems and Congregational Life, A Map for Ministry. It's helpful, it's fun, it's freeing. Robert begins the book by talking about the difference between acute and chronic anxiety. This is a key piece of Bowen theory, so that's how I started the interview, asking him if he could explain what's the difference between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety.
Anxiety itself is just this automatic response we have to any kind of threat we perceive in our environment. And acute anxiety is response to threat that is a real threat, and it's usually time limited. We have to deal with something that is suddenly shows up on our radar as threatening, and we deal with it. Chronic anxiety, on the other hand, is the condition that we are responding in the same sort of way physiologically and emotionally, but the threat is either exaggerated or it's imagined. And we live in a chronic state of anxiety all the time, some ambient level of that all of the time, based on really our level of differentiation and our capacity to manage our reactions to others and to our environment.
So if someone were listening to this and they would say to you, I'm not an anxious person, I don't worry as a habit, and I'm not afraid of much, how would you help them understand the chronic anxiety they might be carrying?
Yeah, anxiety is one of those words that means a lot of different things in common usage, and Bowen uses it really technically. It is a set of physiological responses that are going on all the time as we are taking in the way that the way we perceive others are reacting to us, how much the people we're dependent on are being dependable, and who's depending on us, and whose approval are we seeking, and who do we wish to approve, or who are we disapproving, who's experiencing some sort of distress, and do we move toward that, or am I in distress and is anyone noticing me? There's just dozens of things in our environment we are unconsciously taking in, responding to. And the response is more than just worry. It is, it's the sweat response in our palms. It's our digestive system. It's our heart rate and blood pressure. Our whole body responds to all of that automatically. And so anxiety is just that response to our environment. And there are no non-anxious people in the world, in cemeteries perhaps, but not in walking around. We are always living with some level of response to our environment that involves some level of anxiety, I suppose. And some people have really high levels of chronic anxiety, and others more moderate. And that's part of the scale of differentiation that Murray Bowen talked about.
Yeah, so Murray Bowen, obviously the founder of systems theory, he created the 8 concepts, or he really had 8 different concepts. Some people would say he had 9 at toward the end of his life. One of the concepts that we've not covered on this show that you write so well about is societal regression. Societal regression. Would you mind explaining what that is?
Okay. That was the last concept Bowen added to his theory. And in the 1970s, he was invited by the Environmental Protection Agency to present a paper to some major gathering of theirs. And he had noticed over the years that society seems to do better at times and worse at times in terms of symptoms, things like drug abuse and marital stability. And he had looked at a lot of things. He didn't have access to the internet to do that with at the time, obviously, but he had followed court cases and newspaper reports and such things as that. And he had come to believe that our country, our culture, is in a state of what he called regression. And what he saw that was a parallel between the way a family may move into a regression as anxiety increases, and then the family develops symptoms, and then the symptoms make them more anxious, and it becomes a downward spiral. And he believed those same processes were observable in society at large. This was in the 1970s. And he predicted that we would not pull out of that regression until the middle part of the 21st century. And that those who survived the regression would be a very different kind of human being in one particular aspect. And that was in relationship of all things to the natural world. He believed that the thing that started the regression was a separation between human beings and the natural world. And we began at a lower than conscious level to understand that we no longer had frontiers to conquer, populations increasing, all of these things were going on. And the symptoms that began showing up in the 60s and 70s, things like the Vietnam War and the protest against it and sexual revolution, many other things, he saw those as symptomatic of our anxiety as a society. Of course, they produce their own, the symptoms contribute to the anxiety over time. We get anxious about what's going on. He was pretty perceptive about these things. He knew nothing about climate change and global warming or any of those sorts of things. But I think science and some history has kind of proved him right about some things. And so he said, those symptoms that show up in a regressed society are like symptoms that show up in a family that's going through regression. Basically, we behave on a societal level just like we do on a family level.
Yeah, it's interesting. With your take on Bowen theory, you really focus on this creation care, environmentalism. You mentioned Wendell Berry. I've not read that much in the Bowen theory that I've been exposed to. I think that's a unique contribution you've made there.
I don't think societal regression gets written about much. We have, especially for clergy, we have tended to move very quickly to the question of leadership and what this implies about leadership and managing ourselves in congregations. But I think it's important to take the whole theory and wonder about how these other concepts apply to what we're doing in congregational life.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you also write about, you talk about how Bowen measured societal regression from the 1940s to 1972. You then pick up 21st century and you just make a very brief list of everything that's happened since the year 2000, where we have exponentially become more anxious. And here we are in 2019. I think a lot of people who don't even know anything about Bowen theory they know that we are a much more anxious society than we were even 20 years ago.
We are so driven by our fears and worries and anxiety and our reactivity to each other and to what's going on. Right now it's kind of an obvious thing. Bowen was picking up on that when it was not so easy to document, but you just got to watch an hour's worth of cable news and you've got your documentation.
Well, and I think that's where your work really helps faith leaders, whether they're clergy or just people of faith who lead an organization, is you are helping us lead in the midst of an overwhelmingly anxious culture. I pulled one of the quotes from your book, Robert. You wrote, "Anxious systems look for leaders who will provide palliative care, alleviating the pain of the symptoms without addressing the underlying anxiety with long-term solutions." I think there's pastors everywhere that are shaking their head right now when they hear that. Would you say more about that?
Yeah, when we get anxious, we just want the pain to stop. And that's what we want. And so whether it's in a congregation or presidential election, if somebody can promise to us they can make the pain stop, we're willing to follow them for a time. And when it becomes obvious they can't, we'll discard them and look for somebody else who will. But the solutions are likely to be not pain-free, and they're going to be long-term. We can't make global warming, for example, go away and its effects without some really painful long-term changes. And we don't have any leaders right now with an appetite to insist on that, and certainly not people who are ready to take that leadership and follow it. We'll look for somebody who can, science in many ways and technology got us into this mess, and we think that science and technology is going to get us out. There's going to be a discovery tomorrow or the day after tomorrow that will solve all the problems. And really, the problems are likely to require severe life change on the part of human beings on this planet. And we don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear that.
Well, and I suppose if we take it from that political level and we bring it down to, let's say, a church and individual local church level, you're writing about the same challenge where churches have slowly gotten into problems that are going to take long-term solutions. What are you finding in clergy nowadays, the pressures they're facing, the pressures from within themselves and from within their congregations?
Well, I serve regularly as an interim pastor while I'm teaching at the seminary. And I've had a couple of experiences where you have fairly anxious congregations who, the pastor's left for whatever reason, and they want they put pressure on their search committee to get a new person in there right away, because primarily they're anxious about what it means not to have a senior pastor. And part of my task as interim pastor is to sort of provide some space for that search committee to do its work carefully and thoughtfully and to take its time. And I found that, that's in my head when I go into a role like that to serve. And when congregations calm down a little bit, then they can wait. And sometimes that's one thing, is just like replacing a pastor. That just can't be done too quickly, especially in larger congregations, I've noticed. But probably in smaller ones too, and depending on other things like how the tenure of the previous pastor and the conditions under which they departed. But also, you start to look at the ministries of a congregation, especially in a city. If they're in an area, a city that has changed rapidly, sociologically in one way or another, they want to keep doing the things that they have done in the past. And it's probably going to be some longer term, more thoughtful strategies that are going to be required to deal with the changed environment. And all of our environments have changed. I mean, even if it's not changing socioeconomically, we've certainly changed culturally, so that churches in a booming suburban area, for one thing, are dealing with more and more people whose way of thinking does not include faith. And they're going to be more and more challenged to minister and to communicate to an environment like that. And that quick fixes like changing your style of music or having the pastor wear skinny jeans just aren't going to solve the problem long term of what it means to minister in a place.
I'm sorry, as an interim pastor, you've not tried skinny jeans as the solution yet?
Not yet. I haven't written it off, but
I appreciate that openness. Yeah, maybe it is the actually magic bullet. Maybe
so. I mean, I became all things to all people. I don't know.
Well, and you mentioned people having not having the same faith, and I think one of the unique challenges we're facing nowadays is people have a shared faith, but it means a very different thing to them than it might to you. So people come in saying they have a faith in Jesus, but what that faith looks like and their assumptions about it has radically changed, even in the last 5 years.
And when you have churches that are older churches, full of people my age, I'm 66. my age and older, that's a real challenge to them to even think about the fact that in some way expressions of faith have changed, because for them that doesn't change. And so the anxiety is going to be very high, and they're anxious about, we don't have enough young people in our church. We don't have enough kids. We don't have young adults. What are we going to do? And then, sort of the fine print in the contract is, we want a pastor who will help us reach these people we're not reaching, and we will do everything in our power to keep that from happening. I mean, that's the resistance there. It can be a pretty anxious time.
Yeah.
These days.
Hey, Brennan Reed here, producer of this podcast. Hey, if you know of a college-age student or 20-something who really wants to explore what ministry is like, they should consider spending a year with us at Discovery Christian Church out here in the Front Range of Colorado. My experience with this residency was I wasn't just getting coffee. I actually got to be a part of the church staff, and that meant that I had a voice in meetings. I even got the opportunity to build a ministry from the ground up that Discovery did not have during my residency. And out here, we really try to reach intellectual skeptics as well as followers of Jesus, and we're very passionate about engaging the chronic needs of our city and the world around us. Residents spend a year with us, and they take a class that dives into the material of this podcast. They also take on leadership responsibility, and you come away with a tangible ministry experience to set yourself up for a career in vocational ministry. So as a resident, you get to choose a specialty. We have youth, children's, worship arts, communications, preaching and adult discipleship. We also have local and global outreach and executive pastor work. We do provide housing with a family, and we offer a small stipend. To apply, click the link in the show notes, or you can visit dc2.me, click the About tab, and choose our residency.
Well, I think that brings us to differentiation. And we've discussed differentiation on this show. But in my experience, I've taught systems theory for probably intentionally taught it for 8 years now. And so I'm still on the young end of teaching it. But all of my students, almost without exception, really struggle with differentiation. It feels to them like it's this nebulous, hard to get a hold of thing. They need a few shots at it. So I'd love to hear your take on it, how you help people get into what it is.
Okay. I have collected definitions either from Bowen and other writers and people I've heard. There are just so many ways that people use to describe that and I would say, I would describe it more as a process than a state. I don't think anybody just goes out and gets differentiated and then they're differentiated from then on. Yeah. It is a direction one takes with one's life of trying to be more aware of my own reactivity to others, and then learning to find ways of managing that so that I don't get just run on automatic all the time. It is trying to observe the reactivity in a system that I'm a part of and ask questions about what's my part in this and how can I change my part and what's my responsibility here. It's an effort to be much more self-aware of what's going on inside of you and taking responsibility for that. In a given situation, when I notice my own anxiety spiking for something, the better I act out of differentiation, the more I'm able to say, am I really being threatened right now? If not, then let's calm down. And, the practice of various spiritual disciplines I find to be a really useful way to work on differentiation, is I think that differentiation helps me work on spiritual maturity, I think, in some ways. But it is It's a capacity to know what you believe and what's negotiable in your life and what's not. It's a capacity under pressure from others to conform to what they are demanding, to stand with your own principles in a time like that, calmly and staying in touch with those people. It is a little difficult thing to just give one simple definition and say, there, that's it. But it's easier to think in terms of what would a well-differentiated life look like. And that's kind of how I've tried to describe in the book, preaching and pastoral care and leadership at higher and lower levels of differentiation. One of the most useful things for a person to read on that, I think, is in Murray Bowen's book, Family Therapy and Clinical Practice. He's got places where he just describes people lives lived at various quadrants, 0 to 25 on a scale, 25 to 50, 50, 75, 75 to 100. And he just sort of describes what life lived in those quadrants might look like. And that's somewhat better description for me than just a textbook definition, perhaps.
Yeah, for those who are unfamiliar, Bowen claims that there's a 0 to 100 scale of differentiation.
Right.
You know, Robert, where things get interesting for me is Bowen made the claim almost like we're born into I'm co-opting Bowen, but he would almost say that we were born into a differentiation caste system where we can't really get much more than 10 points higher or lower than our family of origin. I would love to hear your take as a follower of Jesus, if you think the gospel can invade that, because in my life, I would say I came out of a fairly low differentiated family system as I became an adult, and I think the gospel has had profound impact on my level of differentiation. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, Steve. There's a chapter in the book on spiritual formation and differentiation of self, and a chapter on Jesus and differentiation of self. Bowen said that we've probably never met anybody. It's unlikely we've ever met anybody over 50 on the scale. There may be a few individuals in the 50 to 75 range, but the 100 on the scale, which he said was reserved, and the way he put it was for that perfect individual. And so it was totally theoretical. I mean, he said there's nobody in history that's done that. Well, our Christian theology actually affirms that Jesus is not only fully God, but that he's fully human, and none of us are. And so it struck me that, if it might be useful to look at Jesus' life and see what evidence there is of a high level of differentiation. And turns out, even though the gospel writers had no intention of illustrating that, one thing after another in his life does illustrate that.
Yeah.
And so that raised a question for me about, is work on differentiation related to work on Christ likeness or spiritual formation? And what we have in the gospel that Bowen did, Bowen was a scientist, and so the idea of grace or sin, either one, are irrelevant issues for him. Those aren't scientific categories. But we do have access to an understanding of God's grace and God's intention for us in Christ. And I do think it is possible by grace and effort to advance more than the few points that Bowen thought possible on a merely human effort on the scale. But I would also say that advancing a few points makes a heck of a lot of difference in our lives. The illustration I like to use is a baseball player, one that bats lifetime batting average of 250 is going to be a mediocre player. They're not likely to be in the Hall of Fame. They're not going to make the highest salaries. A player that bats 350 lifetime will be Hall of Fame. They play for whoever they want to, and they get to name their own salary. But the difference in their performance is the second guy just gets one more hit in every 10 times at bat than the first guy.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging to me, is that there's a huge difference made with a little bit of improvement on performance.
Yeah.
And if to be able to be, I think of it like that, as if one time in 10, I can be a little more present to those important people in my life, a little less anxious, a little less reactive to their reactivity, it's going to be good for me and good for them.
It's very spooky to hear you say that because early on when I was teaching, I found my students who are very perfectionist minded, they would get these tools. They would learn differentiation, they'd start the path, and they'd fail more than they'd succeed. They've become self-aware, but they haven't built their differentiation muscle. And they, as perfectionists, they would then just use that as another opportunity to condemn themselves. They'd say, well, I should know better by now. And it's spooky to hear you talk about baseball because I actually started teaching them, listen, like even as an Australian, I'm still coming to understand baseball, but a professional baseball batter can bat 300 and get paid millions of dollars for failing more than he succeeds. And so therefore, as you're saying, just a little bit of improvement can bring tremendous relief to a person inside.
Yeah. And Bowen said that too. Bowen said that the quality of life that is found in just a small increase in the level of differentiation is a remarkable thing. And I find myself trying to illustrate some of these things with stories out of my own life and in ministry. And I often introduce that, say, on a good day, this is how Robert's able to behave. And I have good days, but I don't bat 350 yet.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
We also encourage our students to watch movies. I found differentiations really helpful when you can see it on a screen. I'm springing this on you, but does any movie or TV show come to mind when you look at a character and you say, okay, that's a well-differentiated
That's
individual?
a good question. I tend to notice that more in biographies and things, to watch the life of, say, Martin Luther King Jr. or I don't have a movie that's coming to my mind right now. But I do notice that in novels and biographies. Just read in a class that I taught, we read together autobiography of Samuel Proctor, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentor in many ways, very active in the civil rights movement in the U.S. He was involved with government, and he was a Baptist pastor. He's about would have been my parents' age. But it was just remarkable to read his very thoughtful, principle-based decisions that he made as an African-American man growing up in the Jim Crow era and then into civil rights. It really stuck out to me to see that. But I hadn't thought about the movies. I'll have to give that some more thought.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think when people hear differentiation, they can sometimes think it's a leader that stands alone, which is definitely in our culture highly prized. So if you don't mind, I'll just testify. Differentiation for our listeners is not someone who's alone. It's somebody who's principled but still connected to people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll just say a great movie. My first take would be the movie Spotlight. If anyone's ever seen Spotlight, it's the true story of the Boston Globe exposing the Catholic abuse scandal in the early 2000s. I like that movie as an example because there's probably 3 characters who are all having to practice differentiation. And you can see it through the whole journey. And I like it because it's also a true story. It's not a fiction. Martin Luther King is an incredible example. His ability to be well-defined and connected to even his enemies and even those who are out to attack him. I think he was a phenomenally differentiated person. John Perkins, one of King's associates. Yeah. John Lewis as well, who marched on Selma. That they actually taught differentiation without knowing it, I think.
Right. And that's one of the things Bowen said. He didn't invent differentiation himself. He just observed it and tried to label it so that we could see it. And I do know that and Bowen talked about basic self and functional self, but meaning that sometimes we function at a higher level in certain contexts than, for example, people may find it possible to be very well differentiated or fairly well differentiated in their work environment or in their leadership at church or in some cause, and do less well in their home, and find themselves more reactive to the people in their family, which are the most intense relationships in our life. And that's why that's probably the best place to go to work on this, is not congregational life. You work on different, I tell people, it's talk about movies. It's like The Lord of the Rings. It's, the place you do this is you have to go to Mount Doom. You have to go
back to Mount Doom.
You got to go where the ring was forged, if you're going to work on it. And so, to work on differentiation, you return to your parents, your home, and your own nuclear family, because those are the most intense relationships. And if you can learn to function as an adult, a principled adult, calmly and still connected to mom and dad or to your spouse and children, you can do fine with people in the congregation. But that's the more intense relationships.
I think that's a great, very tangible piece of advice. If people want to be healthier leaders, go back to Mount Doom, go back to your family of origin, and that work will pay off in every other aspect of your life. That's really helpful. Well, Robert, I'm sorry to warn you that it's time to inflict upon you my gauntlet of questions on anxiety.
Okay.
So if you brace yourself like a man, I've had this described as somewhere between a roller coaster ride and a proctological exam.
Okay.
So in the spirit of that, I'm going to ask 6 questions. Feel free to pass or play on all of them or none of them.
Okay.
You hold the power. But
Okay.
I found this is really helpful for our listeners as people come on and they share their own anxiety. So we always begin with the physiology of anxiety. You've hinted at that. Between a spinning mind and a racing heart and a tightening gut, where would you say anxiety begins for you?
Tightening gut.
Would you say more about that?
Well, I just know that's the place I just sort of notice it first. I don't get confused in my thinking right away or fearful with a racing heart, but there's just a sense in my gut that this is not the way I want things to be.
Okay.
And I felt that physiological experience lots of times.
Very good. We mentioned at the very top of the episode chronic anxiety. I believe one of the ways you can start to identify chronic anxiety is when you're not getting what you believe you need in any given moment. You don't actually need it, but you believe you need it, and so you become chronically anxious. Would you be able to name something that you believe you need in any given moment? Sometimes for guests, I have to give an example. I don't know if that'd be helpful or if this makes sense right away for you.
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind is I have adult children, and I can find myself what I deeply want for them, I have no control over providing. And I, with a couple of them in particular, there are things I pray about and want and desire for them, and just coming to terms with the reality that I can't make that happen. That I think that's anxiety producing in me, and finding a way to deal with that in prayer and theology is important to me.
Yeah.
But my mind can dash off toward one of those characters real easy.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah. Another source of anxiety that I think is common to all leaders and also all parents is every mistake we make is a public mistake. We live our lives vulnerably and in front of people. And therefore, the way we respond to making a mistake really helps us with our long-term leadership health. So I wonder if you'd be willing to share a recent mistake you've made and what you did to recover from it.
I realized that after a conversation with one of my female colleagues that I had used an expression that probably 20 years ago would probably not have been offensive, but that could be in our current context. And I had no more stepped out the door of her office and gotten down the sidewalk, and it dawned on me, the gut thing. And I turned around and went back in and offered an apology. And she said it was fine. She just thought it was funny. But nevertheless, that kind of stuck with me even after apologizing. Just to realize that there are these automatic responses that are hardwired into me that come out without thinking. And a more thoughtful person in that moment would have expressed himself differently. And which, that's sort of running on automatic kind of thing. So that's been fairly resonant in the last couple of weeks.
I tell you why I love that example is I think it's a great example of how you're ongoing working on self-differentiation, because I think the tendency of a lot of leaders is to hide their mistakes. Or to me, it's Genesis 3, we hide or we blame when we're exposed. But you actually, in that story, you just mentioned it briefly, you used your source of anxiety as a trigger to go work on recovery rather than avoid. Like you said, I noticed that thing in my gut, so I immediately walked back. I think that's just a helpful tool that anxiety can actually become an asset once you get the hang of it.
Well, you're not going to get rid of it, so it might as well be your ally, in some way or another. But again, we don't ever become not anxious people. We become increasingly able to manage our anxiety and our reactivity, and take responsibility for our reactions and be more thoughtful instead of automatic. But it's the thing that dawns on you in a time like that is that's not in line with my principles. That's not in line with the kind of person I want to be. And so I do think correcting that to whatever degree is possible and owning that I acted outside my professed principles, and I'd like to get things lined up a little better.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great example. I think this is going to be a low ball for you, Robert, but for our listeners, we're also helping them understand that anxiety is always contagious in a group, and oftentimes the most anxious person in a room can have the most power unless a leader is differentiated. Would you mind just sharing a recent example of where you've seen anxiety be contagious in a group of people?
Yeah, anxiety is contagious. Actually, just about everything is contagious. But the church I'm currently serving as interim pastor has, in addition to their pastor leaving February a year ago, has had 2 other staff members retire, one in February, one in March, after long tenures there. Nothing surprising, those were planned. And then another staff member accept a call from this church in Texas to a church in Indiana, but it was a church. It's his wife's family's church. They were married. He and his wife were married there, and they called him to be the lead pastor. And he had been 16 years in this congregation here in Texas. That wasn't as expected by the congregation, but he held he was an executive pastor here. And so the anxiety in the congregation has spiked a bit, to say the least. And we were in a meeting a few weeks ago of key lay leaders and staff. And I think there was one voice in the room that was a little more anxious than the rest. And you could almost visibly see when they were speaking and raising their questions and issues, the attraction of the rest of the room toward to want to calm that person down or tell them it's going to be all right or something like that. But there was definitely a reaction to the reactivity, not I was surprised what a thoughtful group of people there were in that room that day, but it doesn't take much for that to, be tested with somebody's anxiety. I think it may have been Ed Friedman said that we tend to get organized around the least mature person in the system.
Right. That's right. Yeah. That's Friedman.
Yeah. And I kind of keep an eye out for that, is that we don't want to exclude the least mature person in the system, but they don't need to have the authority that they're often given.
Yeah, I think Friedman would suggest that if we really cared for them, we would not coddle them. That was part of, and of course, Friedman, I think there's a lot of debate over whether he was well differentiated or just cold. Like he's really, I remember reading a story where he was speaking at a conference and a lady during the Q&A kept trying to cut to the front of the line. And he just basically turned on the whole room because, she was anxious to cut in line. And I don't know, it's just, Friedman's an interesting character for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I think another source of anxiety, particularly for a faith leader, is I think we can conflate our identity with Christ with being an employee of Christ. I know I'm a lead pastor, and this for me is a constant struggle. I'm a child of God, but I also work for the boss.
Yeah.
And so I found it very helpful to really make sure I'm running in the stream of God's gifts that are just for me and that are not also for my congregation. So these last two questions get to that. Would you mind telling us when in your life you feel most fully loved?
I'm probably going to take that to family and just say when I'm in the context of my children live in North Carolina, Alaska, and Houston, and we're never all in the same place at the same time, or we very seldom are. But when that happens, or even when 2 out of 3 of them are present with grandchildren and all, I think there's more of a sense of being loved and being in a place of security than probably any other time in my life.
Great.
I probably find that there.
And then the last question is similar. What activities or places make you feel most fully alive? And it doesn't have to be all of them, if you just give us a couple of examples.
Yeah. Truthfully, right where I am at this moment is our farm outside of San Antonio. It was my grandparents' place. We inherited it about 12 years ago. It's 88 acres is all it is. We've just recently gotten a grant from Texas Parks and Wildlife to take it out of agricultural production. We'd had it leased out, and to plant native grasses and restore tall grass prairie. My wife and I have been working in our garden out here this week, and the wildflowers are just absolutely gorgeous at this place. We went walking in the field yesterday and looking for evidence of the growth of some of those seeds we planted back then. This is the most life-giving spot on earth for me. And not everybody thinks of South Texas as the most beautiful place on earth, but in springtime, it's right up there in the competition. It's been a beautiful place, but it's life-giving for me to be here.
Oh, I love that.
We'll retire here in a couple of years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I hear you, and what comes to mind is I think you're making Wendell Berry and Lyle Lovett very proud.
Oh, well, good. Wendell Berry's been pretty important to me as a thinker. I read him first because Eugene Peterson mentioned him in one of his books on pastoral ministry and said, if you want to understand what it means to be a pastor, read Wendell Berry. And wherever he says land or farm, read congregation. And where he says farmer, read pastor. And so I was reading Berry metaphorically for a while. And then we inherited this place, and suddenly I had land. I was a city boy. I lived in Houston, Texas for 50 years. And the only land I ever take care of was my yard, my lawn. And suddenly I've got near 100 acres that I'm responsible for. And we decided to keep it and then figure out how to care for it. And so Berry became much more literal than metaphorical for me after that. Yeah. So I enjoy reading Berry a lot. He challenges me so much.
Yeah, he's a good voice.
If you want to read a good definition of differentiation of self, you might read his poem, "The Mad Farmer's Liberation Front." That would be one, but there are several of his poems that sort of express or the contrariness of the mad farmer. That would be another one. But I think Berry is one of the better differentiated figures in our culture right now.
Yeah, that's a good word. I'll put a link to that poem in our show notes for the episode.
Okay.
And of course, I'd mentioned the book at the top of the episode too. So for our listeners, I'll be putting Robert's book in the show notes as well. It's such a great treatment of systems theory, particularly for any faith leaders. Even though, Robert, you're writing for congregational life, I really do think it's a book that's helpful for any person of faith who's leading an organization. There's a lot of principles there.
Be helpful.
Yeah.
Also, if I could put another plug in, Baker Academic, who published that book, partnered with Jim Harrington and Tricia Taylor and I to do a second edition of The Leader's Journey, and that will be out in January of 2020.
Yes, thank you for mentioning it. Jim's been on the show. I think we have Tricia coming up in the fall, actually.
Good.
But The Leader's Journey is another classic in systems theory.
Well, we've added a couple of chapters to that and done some serious revision of it, and so it will be. I'm really pleased with the upgrade there after a dozen years or so on the shelf. So.
Robert, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for coming in from the wildflowers to come and chat with me. Thanks for joining us today. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram from the handle Steve Cusswords. You can also go to stevecusswords.com for more resources.
This episode has been a production of Brendan Reed and Steve Cuss.